Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my new video. In today's video I'm going to be talking about the Korean War and how there's a lot of similarities with what happened in the Korean War with what's happening now with regards to the island of Taiwan. And I'm going to explain why. I'm going to give you my thoughts. I'm going to give you also a brief history lesson as well. I'm going to be talking about stuff that you don't really see or hear in the textbooks. So without further ado, let's carry on with the show. So the Korean War started in June 1950 and ended in July 1953, and it was a 3-year war, and it's not very much spoken about in the United States, mainly because there were so many casualties that the US suffered. So let's go through some numbers. In terms of casualties, I'm going through by the wiki, by the way. It says here approximately 3 million people died in the Korean War. In terms of US casualties, 33,000 battle deaths along with 2,830 non-battle deaths and 17,730 other deaths. I just don't understand why they would put 17,730 other deaths. Were they dead because of accidents, or because they did die during the Korean War? So it seems like an awful long big number to die of other deaths and not battle deaths. So altogether it looks like they had about, calculating all of that, 50 to 60,000 deaths. Then you have injuries in terms of casualties, and the injuries are going from the numbers of 300,000 to 500,000, and on some records I'm seeing up to 1 million US casualties in terms of injuries. Also some people gone missing and things like that. And in terms of costs, how much did this cost the United States? Well, the figures on wiki, it says 30 billion. And 30 billion might not sound a lot to you right now. However, back in 1950s, 30 billion is a lot of money, and I am talking a lot of money. In terms of inflation, in today's money, you know, if there was a Korean War, we're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars it would have cost in today's inflation rates. But yeah, back then 30 billion was a lot of money. In terms of Chinese deaths, and then again I'm going through the wiki at the moment, so I'm not sure about the source, I'm not sure about the numbers. So it says here they have suffered 114,000 battle deaths, 34,000 non-battle deaths, 340,000 wounded, and 7,600 missing. And you got to understand, back then the Chinese were very poor. They didn't really have much of a technological army. They did not have a air force. They did not have a navy. They hardly had any technology that they were fighting with. It's pretty much with guns. So those numbers in terms of the Chinese side is not that much compared to what US had suffered and what South Koreans had suffered as well. So going back to the Korean War, you know, the two Koreans started fighting with each other, and I'm not going to go into why because it's not important at this stage. I think the point I'm trying to make is about America and also China. So America decided to get involved and help South Korea, as they do. They did it unilaterally, again without any UN resolution. Very similar to what they did with Iraq. They went in without any UN resolution. They went in illegally. They went in unilaterally as well. And this was a time when China had just won its civil war with Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek ran away to Taiwan. So both Korean leaders at the time, they both wanted to rule all of the Korean peninsula, and the South Koreans were obviously allied with the United States, and the North Koreans were allied with the Russians, and obviously they were communists. So obviously at the time, North Korea was winning the war. They drove the South Koreans all the way to the southern part of South Korea, near Busan, and they were winning the war. And this is when the Americans got involved unilaterally, and they started sending bombing runs and started driving the North Koreans back towards the middle line. So where does China come into all of this? Well, China first said that they do not want to get involved in Korea's internal affairs. However, they mentioned that there was 3 daggers pointing at China at the time. The first dagger was coming from the Korean Peninsula, with the United States obviously winning the war with the North Koreans. The second dagger was coming from the Taiwanese Strait. Americans had actually had a lot of military equipment in Taiwan. They had a lot of military installations, and they had an army as well in Taiwan, and there was basically sending attacks from Taiwan into Korea at the time. And the third dagger was happening in Vietnam. There was a colonial war happening in Vietnam, and the Americans were obviously supporting the South Vietnamese. There was also an important issue regarding Taiwan at the time. America had invaded Taiwan and put all of these American bases all around Taiwan as well, and they were using it as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. And they promised to give back Taiwan to the Chinese. However, the Americans have said that the Taiwan fate is currently undecided. So obviously the Chinese people at the time were very, very angry and felt completely humiliated. And they voiced their concerns to the UN, and it fell on deaf ears. The Chinese were not really taken any seriously in the UN whatsoever. And take a look at this.
In a speech to the Security Council. The Korean Civil War cannot in any way justify or excuse America's armed aggression against Taiwan. Dear delegates, can you imagine Italy having the right to occupy Corsica because of the Spanish Civil War? Can you imagine the United Kingdom having the right to occupy Florida because of the Mexican Civil War? This would be nonsensical and inconceivable.
So you can see the Chinese were very, very unhappy regarding the Americans' actions along the Taiwanese Strait, and also their actions in Korea as well. And during that time, the Americans were going closer and closer towards the North Korean and Chinese borders. They were beating back the North Korean army. And the Chinese had to make a decision, and they've had kind of a couple of telegrams coming from the Soviet Union saying you must help North Korea. But the Chinese couldn't really help North Korea at the time, because they just got out of a really severe civil war of themselves, and obviously they've become successful from the civil war. But it was literally 1 year after the civil war, and obviously a lot of people needed to rebuild their country. There was no agriculture, there was no technology, so China needed time to build their country, and this was literally 1 year after winning the civil war. And China did not want to get involved. This was absolutely the wrong time for them to get involved in the Korean War. However, they were being humiliated over and over again. All of their kind of warnings were falling on deaf ears. America was pushing more and more troops towards the Chinese borders, and China had to act. So obviously at the time China was very poor, and they did not really have much of a military to fight the United States. Back then, United States was a superpower. They had an amazing military, they had an amazing air force. No country in their right mind would be able to stand up against the United States at the time. So China needed time to rebuild their country. People were poor. People were dying because of the famine. A lot of people were dying of hunger. So, this is the last thing that China wanted, was to get involved in this war. So they had a meeting, and, things were very, very undecided at the time. And they knew, they did not want to get involved, but they felt that they were being forced to. They felt that they were being humiliated. And, they had to make a decision fast. Despite various warnings by the Chinese to the Americans at the time, and they did say, if you keep going into the Chinese border, we will have no choice but to act. But President Truman at the time, he completely ignored the Chinese warnings. He thought the Chinese were not very powerful economically as well as military. There's not much they could do. Even if they attack, they could be easily defeated. So the Americans didn't really take much notice with the Chinese warnings. And a lot of these Chinese troops, they were very much battle hardened from the Civil War. They had all sorts of rifles, and each rifle needed different types of ammunition, which they didn't have. And they needed to get it from the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union said at the time they will provide all the ammunition that they need. And they will also provide air support to the Chinese as well, because the Chinese didn't have an air force. So the Soviet Union promised they would provide air support to the Chinese. And this was a very much a decision made by Chairman Mao at the time, and because he thought the Russians would provide air support, it would be much easier for the Chinese to drive back the Americans. However, when Chairman Mao decided to kind of intervene in this war, and they pretty much got stabbed in the back by the Soviets. The Soviets said, hang on, we cannot give you air cover. It's going to take us months and months to organize something like that. And he kept coming up with excuses. Then he kept saying, I don't want to get involved. So our Soviets do not want to get involved in this war. We're having a Cold War with the United States. We don't want to get involved. So they were dragging their heels. And this was kind of like the beginning of the end of the relationship between China and the Soviet Union. A lot of the trust had broken down during this war, because the Chinese felt that they were going in to fight this war, and they didn't get any help from the Soviet Union. And this is why when President Nixon went to China in 1972, the Chinese decided to turn their backs on the Soviets, because the Soviets, in their history, they didn't really help the Chinese much. They didn't help the Chinese when it came to the Korean War. They didn't help the Chinese when it came to Vietnam. And the Chinese just felt really abandoned and kind of stabbed in the back by the Soviets. So the Soviets did provide a lot of ammunition at the time. However, it's not exactly air power. And with air power, the Chinese could have lost much less people than they did. So the Chinese decided to go into war with the United States anyway, to help the North Koreans, but they didn't want to do it officially. So what they did was they organized what you call a volunteer army, and they basically asked the people, whoever wants to fight this war against the Americans, please stand up. I'm not going to force you to go there. If you want to, you can go, and you'll be a volunteer army basically. So Chairman Mao said at the time that even without air cover, it would be much harder to fight the Americans. However, we had to fight. And even if we couldn't win, we'd still be fighting when they were ready. This showed how determined he was to protect Chinese interests, no matter how weak China was at the time. And they just couldn't sit back and do nothing. So basically, China, you have to understand how weak China was. They just got out of a civil war. They literally have no technology whatsoever, no air force, no navy. They hardly had any weapons. They had a lot of guns, but hardly any bullets. While America was one of the greatest superpowers of that generation, with a huge air force, with a huge navy, and there was a huge presence of American soldiers in South Korea, and it would have been suicide for any country to go against the United States at that time. But they felt that they didn't have a choice, and again, the Americans were very arrogant with their approach. They didn't take any warnings from the Chinese. When the Chinese said about, you must leave Taiwan, this is our territory, they didn't leave. They said, you must leave the borders. These borders are our borders. You must leave, go down, and the Americans didn't even listen. They were completely humiliating the Chinese at the time, and the Chinese felt that this was a matter of pride. They have no choice but to go in, and that's what they did. And even though they had no air power from the Soviets, and hardly had any help from the Soviets apart from providing ammunitions and guns, the Chinese basically went there themselves and decided to go for it themselves. Even if it meant that all of their troops would be massacred, even if it meant that China would be destroyed, they just felt that they had to act, because whether they were ready now or whether they were ready 10 years later, it would have been too late. Because if America had taken over all of Korea, they would have set up bases all over Korea, and it would have been very, very difficult to get rid of these American bases, if they waited 5 years, 10 years down the line. And also, if they didn't act now, there would be American bases all over Taiwan as well. So the Chinese felt that they had no choice. They had to act now, even though they had no weapons, no military, no air force, no navy. They just felt that they had no choice. This was national pride. So during the war, the Chinese basically sneaked up on South Korean positions and as well as American positions, and it was a first phase offensive, and it was more of a very much a surprise attack. They've destroyed all of the 6th Infantry Division of South Korea. They killed a lot of South Korean soldiers at the time. And after destroying all of the South Korean bases and infantry divisions, they went and attacked the American bases around Unsan. Unsan was one of the biggest battles the Americans had with the Chinese. And this is the time when Chinese, they used their huge number of troop count as well as surprise attacks, and they surrounded Unsan. And Unsan was the place where Americans suffered the most casualties in any war, and they suffered huge casualties, not only to their men but also injuries as well as loss of so many equipment and tanks. But yes, the Americans lost a lot under Unsan, and it went on from there, and the Chinese went and took base after base after base. I think the Americans had underestimated the Chinese. Even though the Chinese didn't have any technological weapons, they had huge amounts of manpower, and they were battle hardened from the Civil War as well. They had a lot of experience fighting in the Civil War. They were battle hardened. They had a lot of determination, willpower, and in the end, their troop numbers, willpower, and determination counted more than anything. And the Americans had to retreat. The South Koreans had to retreat as well, and the Chinese basically drove them back to the border. Another great victory for the Chinese was the Battle of Lake Chongjing, I believe. They released a couple of films which made a lot of money in the Chinese box office, showing what happened. If you haven't seen it, it's probably worth watching. But yeah, as you can see from these moving pictures, how the Chinese drove the South Koreans and the Americans, all the way back to the borderline again. And despite all of America's might and navy, and despite all of their air force, they couldn't drive the Chinese back, and they felt that they had no choice but to sign a peace deal, sign an armistice with the North Koreans. And basically this is when they set up the demilitarized zone across the middle of South Korea and North Korea, mainly because of the Chinese. So you can see, what the Americans did, they completely underestimated the Chinese, and they underestimated the Chinese in the Vietnam War as well, despite the Chinese warning them again and again and again. And this was a time when, like I said, the Chinese had no, hardware, military. They weren't really known as a big military force at the time. But the Americans decided to be arrogant. They decided to be completely not listening to them, not listening to their red lines, and they went and gone ahead. And this is what they're doing in present times as well. They did not listen to Putin's warnings. They did not listen to Putin's red lines about Ukraine joining NATO, and this is what happens. In a document released by the Pentagon, this document is called "The Two Strategic Intelligence Mistakes in the Korean War." The CIA admitted U.S. intelligence failings, and they admitted that they have discounted the Chinese threat, despite the Chinese giving them various warnings not to go into the border between North Korea and China, not to use Taiwan as a military base, and not to support the South Vietnamese as well. So despite various warnings, and the US decided to completely discount the Chinese threat. And this is what happened, really. And back then, China wasn't that powerful, but they are a lot more powerful now, and they are basically doing the same thing. Despite repeated warnings by China about Taiwan, about do not cross our red lines, do not cross our red lines, do not cross our red lines. This is an internal issue. We want to, have a peaceful reunification. Do not get involved in our internal affairs. Despite various warnings, the US is still antagonizing China. It is still provoking China when it comes to Taiwan. They are sending delegates there. They are sending warships to the Taiwanese Strait. They are sending, people like Pelosi, other delegates, and they are basically pushing China. And this seems like very much similar to what's happened in the Korean War. They kept pushing and they kept pushing and they kept pushing the Chinese, and eventually the Chinese are just going to snap, and they're going to say, you know what, F it, we're just going to go and take Taiwan by force, because what the US is doing, they are embarrassing us, and they are basically pushing for separatists, they're pushing for independence, and they're simply not listening to our red lines. And this is what happens. This is what happened then, and this seems like it's very much happening right now as well. And the only difference between China in the 1950s compared to China as of today, they have a very, very strong military as of today, which they didn't have before. So imagine all of the Chinese willpower and strength of the 1950s, plus with all of these added benefits of added hardware, added navy, added air force. Imagine the force that China could become if there was a war in the Taiwanese Strait between the Chinese and the Americans. This is a war that America will not win. If there is a war in the Taiwanese Strait, they will not win it. I guarantee you, because the American people are not going to stand for it. First of all, there's going to be a lot of American soldiers coming back in body bags, and it's going to be Vietnam all over again. The people are going to stand up. They're going to be rioting in the streets. They're going to want America to pull out, because at the end of the day, this is not American people's war. They don't, they were lied to when it came to Vietnam. They said, oh, there's a big problem with communism. If we don't fight in Vietnam, communism will take over the world. Well, has communism taken over the world? They find these excuses to basically fight these wars all around the world and lie to their people. And once these Americans, start dying in this war, and once all these body bags start coming back to America, trust me, the support for this war in America will go down. America cannot fight long wars. They cannot fight it because, their politicians cannot survive a long war. They can survive for maybe a few years, but not more than that, because people are not going to stand for it, especially when you have all of these body bags coming home. They are fighting this ridiculous, disastrous proxy war with Russia, with every single last Ukrainian, and now they want to, basically start another fight with China. And I know what's going to happen. They're going to basically use that as a proxy war as well, fight China with every single last Taiwanese, every single last Japanese, every single last South Korean, every single last Australian, maybe even the British. But I can guarantee you this is not a war that they can win very easily. The Chinese are very, very powerful. They might not be a blue water navy. Yeah, I understand that American army is right now is a blue water navy. They have 800 bases around the world. They are one of the greatest military mights the world has ever seen. Their submarine fleet is amazing. Their navy is amazing. Their air force is amazing. So yeah, you cannot discount the Americans. Of course not. I mean, they are one of the biggest, greatest American militaries the world has ever seen. Of course not. But with every single battle scenario that the American generals have fought along the Taiwanese Strait, every single scenario they have lost. Because along the Taiwanese Strait, the Chinese have a huge advantage. They have hundreds and thousands of missiles pointing at the Taiwanese Strait, hypersonic missiles. So if any American ships or aircraft carriers come near the Taiwanese Strait, they will be simply blown out the water. Sure, Americans have a huge advantage when it comes to submarines. Yeah, they have a huge advantage. But the fact is, submarines won't win you that war. You need foots on the ground. You need, soldiers on the ground in Taiwan. You need Taiwan to be re-equipped. Because once Taiwan gets blockaded and the oil runs out, the food runs out, then that's it. The government will fall. They'll fall very easily. So in order to prolong the war, America will have to supply weapons to Taiwan. They'll have to supply food. They'll have to supply oil and gas. And they won't be anywhere near the Taiwanese Strait, because if any ships come anywhere near the Taiwanese Strait, they'll be blown out the water. So as you can see, every single scenario the generals have done, the Americans have done, they have lost. And there is no way. Every single year China is getting stronger and stronger. They have a huge manufacturing base. So during war times, all of these factories will start churning out military weapons. And because China is the factory of the world, they can churn out these weapons very fast, very cheap. They will be outgrowing US military in terms of numbers, in terms of people, as well as hardware, as well as weapons. There's no way in hell this is a war the America would win. The best solution for all parties is for America and China to work towards a peaceful solution for reunification, and America to work with a peaceful solution with Russia when it comes to Ukraine. Basically all they have to do with Ukraine is tell Ukraine they're not going to join NATO and start implementing the Minsk agreements. It might be too late now, but maybe it will be a start to stop supplying weapons to Ukraine, for example, and start having peace talks. There is no point in antagonizing all of these countries and pushing these countries' red lines all over the world. I mean, what is the point of doing that? It's much better to focus on peace rather than war. And that's my point for today, guys. Let me know what you think of this video. It was quite a different one. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you in the next video. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, whatever you can to help support the channel. If you can join my Patreon, or if you can join my locals, it'll be amazing. And also you can buy me a coffee as well. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you soon.